Let's do some visualization. Close your eyes and picture this. The year is 1650 and it's the dead of winter. There's a father and son in a small Roman domicile. The father says something along the lines of, "Come on, kiddo, grab your coat." The kid runs over excitedly to go grab his jacket to brave the cold winds, and they run down the road to the theater to the show. The father and son eagerly wait as they sit on some wooden bleachers above the stage, and they await the players. The players are brought out and the crowd cheers loudly. The leading man plays to the crowd as they cart in his co-star, a corpse. The crowd waits on every line of dissection. In this video, we're going to take a look at the bizarre public dissections of the Renaissance, a phenomenon that spread throughout Europe where you could go to a public amphitheater and watch your favorite physician operate on a lifeless corpse. Strange to say the least. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Before we begin, we need to know the person who started all of this. His name was Andreas Vesalius. Vesalius is considered to be the father of modern anatomy and wrote some of the first comprehensive texts on the subject, such as the famous 7 books on the structure of the human body. Vesalius was from a family of physicians and pharmacists. He studied at the Catholic University of Leuven and attended medical school at the University of Paris. Vesalius' specialty was studying bones and cadavers. At the time, bones were easily accessible in the cemeteries of Paris, very easily. He was known for a number of things in regards to this. As a guiding star to his beliefs, he used various strategies to obtain cadavers to operate upon. He believed that anatomy should not be simply studied by physicians, but by all capable Christian men. So he did some, let's say, controversial things to get cadavers. He would use his influence within the academic community to get criminals sentenced to life in prison executed. He would then seek out their corpses to repurpose their bodies for dissection and study. Vesalius' work was invaluable and it cannot be understated, but he taught his contemporaries some questionable habits. After the death of Vesalius, the demand for cadavers didn't subside and it only picked up steam. In the mid-17th century, the shady practices of Vesalius were now industry norms, and anatomical dissection was a spectator sport. The earliest examples of these dissection theaters were built in 1594. These theaters found themselves all the way across Europe to include Leiden, Paris, London, and Amsterdam. These cities quickly found themselves to be among Europe's newest tourist attractions and burgeoning industries. Vesalius' goals were being realized. Dissections were no longer just reserved for physicians and academics. People of all walks of life were in attendance to these widely strewn events. Politicians, social elite, merchants, public officials, and royalty were all spotted at the events to chop it up with one another and observe a feat of skill and study. Vesalius' acquisition techniques were spread as far as the theaters themselves. By the 18th century, the demands for cadavers were at an all-time high. Public hearings were lobbied to make sentences harsher. Life sentences were influenced to become hangings. Grave robbings were, of course, on the rise. The once easily accessible bones of Vesalius' time were long gone. The pressure of the ticketed and lucrative events drove aspiring physicians to exhume corpses to have a subject to entertain the masses. The philosophy of the era emphasized learning and the interpolation of the divine and the mundane. The knowledge of anatomy advanced so quickly during the era that there were paper dissections that accompanied these events. The viewers of these procedures could perform their own dissections on bodies composed of masterfully layered drawings that curious crowds could peel back one at a time to reinforce the lecture that was just performed. These events were oftentimes used as headlining events at Carnival, the apex of cultural society of the time. Vesalius and his contemporaries' beliefs that it was a moral duty to study human anatomy was incredibly ironic. The collection techniques of the physicians who performed these procedures were nearly monstrous. Desecrating the graves of the dead and trying to influence the judicial structures of the era spat directly in the face of the perceived divine purpose of anatomical study. In England, the experimentation on the executed criminals was a continuation of their sentencing. blessing in a way. The courts viewed the experimentation as the criminals continued to atone for their crimes and sins. The practice became so popular that the medical students that needed the actual hands-on training had to fight for seats. They couldn't concentrate on the methods of dissection or the body structures due to the commonality of live music and theatricality. This led to private dissections for these particular students, which not only led to a decrease in direct crowds, but a somewhat lessened novelty effect for the potential physicians and academics. However, it only increased the demands for cadavers. In later years, public dissection experiments went on to take a whole new role with figures such as Giovanni Aldini, who set out to raise the dead with electricity. In 1803, an Englishman was executed for the alleged murder of his wife and daughter at Newgate Prison. The man, George Foster, was executed and his body was left hanging outside in the sub-freezing temperatures for 2 hours. After he was chilled, George was carted a mile to London's Royal College of Surgeons Anatomy Theatre. Inside the theatre was exactly what you would expect of a typical dissection of the time. The social elite and academics were packed inside to view the event. In the center of the room was a 40-year-old scholar, Giovanni Aldini. Aldini thought that electricity could reanimate the dead, and on this day, he was going to prove it to the audience. The assembly hauled George Foster's body to the center of the theater, and the show had started. Aldini attached the various electrodes to George's body, and to the surprise of all in attendance, his eye opened and twitched. His arms and legs flailed and the crowd was amazed, with the exception of Aldini. Aldini considered the experiment a failure after the battery died after a few hours. His attempt at reviving the dead was unsuccessful, but the influence was not lost on a very young lady in Somerstown, a lady whose name was Mary Shelley. Shelley's description of the procedure in her novel Frankenstein was nearly identical to the descriptions that witnesses of Aldini's 1803 experiment gave. In the United Kingdom, the actual taking of a corpse from their resting place was not criminal until the Anatomy Act of 1832. Grave robbing had been a practice since the times of the pharaohs in Egypt, and the illegal trade of corpses had become a health, criminal, and civil threat due to the popularity of these public dissections and attempted resurrections, such as Aldini's. The act made it illegal to grave rob and set modern precedent for medical students to only operate on donated cadavers. Criminality was rampant in these trades. There were con artists, middlemen who paid church officials, and of course the grave robbers themselves that involved themselves in the lucrative practices of this particular underground. In the decades that followed, interest in public dissection experiments waned, in addition to the new legislation that was passed by more developed nations in regards to grave robbing. New pedagogical practices emerged, and the difficulties in gathering cadavers contributed to the decline of the practice. In closing, from the mind of Andreas Vesalius sprung forth an anatomical revolution that took Europe by storm. Through the study of this era, our understanding of the human body advanced faster than even Vesalius's wildest dreams. The irony of studying morality through the means of influencing trials and grave robbing is something that would make Dexter Morgan smile. This study of death in a positive and enlightening way made Europeans of the era's relationship with death very similar to something like Los Dias de los Muertos. Tokens of the dead decorated the packed halls as the reality star physicians excited the crowd with the stigmatas of their scalpel strokes. Today, the celebrity status of the intellectual elite is a far cry from the status of reality stars, but our fascination with death has remained. What are your thoughts on these practices? Was it simply part of the evolution of the advancing fascination that mankind has with its own morality, or was it a criminal undertaking that spat in the face of the supposed enlightenment it hoped to achieve? Let us know in the comments down below. As always, thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more videos.